German professor of sports studies. He earned his BA in English from the UCLA in 1967 and his PhD from the University of Cologne, Modern and Medieval History in Germany in 1971. He attended the UCLA on a track scholarship and was 10 times German champion and represented West Germany at the 1968 Summer Olympics in the 1,500 meter run, where he reached the semi-final. He is now a fellow of the US National Academy and the European College of Sports and History and the editor-in-chief of European Studies and Sports History. Professor Kruger, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. Thanks to Anna and the Portuguese Olympic Committee. Sometimes I don't know which hat to wear, because I've been an athlete, I've been a coach, I've been a sports administrator, and I'm a researcher and a university person. So if from all of these heads I don't really meet your expectations, please excuse that sometimes I sort of change hats. Now, we have also the Lower Saxony Institute of Sport History, Germany being a federal republic with 16 states. Lower Saxony is one of the 16, and the more you do regional, local history and biographical studies, the more the shift of the Olympics change. Because for a person, it's different than for a newspaper or a government. I'm looking at pictures because obviously the Olympic Games are not a war, but the more you look at how wars are being fought, not just in the case of the Vietnam War, where it's obvious this, because there's a lot of literature about that it was lost because of the pictures. There's a lot of literature that Fidel Castro won the revolution with the help of Time magazine and New York Times. And even the Eiffel Tower was a symbol of French engineering skill, of French might, and it served as something the French wanted to show to the world, that they could actually own half of Africa. So you have to be aware that at this time television was not there, newsreel was slow, so a lot of things happened with radio and with newspapers. A little later, George Orwell said, international sport and the Olympics are war minus the shooting. So this is basically what I will do. I will say something about our own images of some of the Olympic Games. Then I talk about coup d'etat, about nationalism and the political system, using the big stage of the Olympic media event, the Olympic Games and war, why are the Olympic Games so successful, and finally some open questions. Probably you have more open questions, at least these are some that result from the paper. Now you see me running there so that, you know, pictures are also part of memory. At that time I had 25 kilo less of weight, and this was probably 30 kilo less fat and 5 kilo less muscle. Most of you will have some sort of an image of the 1936 Olympic Games with the Black Power salute. And this tells you something else as well. The athletes were kicked out of the Olympic Village at the time, and later on they were introduced into the American Hall of Fame because of their courageous effort. So if you win a war, you're a freedom fighter before. If you lose the war, you stay the terrorist. So a lot depends on your perspective, and the perspective may change in a lifetime. This is about Beeman, so this is something completely apolitical. Actually, I saw it from this perspective, that's why I showed you that perspective, because I was at the athlete's stand looking at it. But what I kept remembering about the 36 Olympic Games, about the 68 Olympic Games, was that when we marched into the stadium, we marched into between a row of 12 tanks, 6 on either side, because there had been the Tlatelolco massacre just prior to the Olympics, with about 200 people being shot and student unrest in the city. So there were some 500 paratroopers in the Olympic Stadium protecting the spectators of the Olympic Stadium. Now, of course, these pictures you probably don't see too much of, but if you were there, these pictures are very vivid, because you don't really march that often into what was supposed to be the highlight of your career, between tanks, and then be protected by paratroopers. So this is basically the problem of the lecture. I have certain pre-knowledge. Every one of you has certain pre-knowledge, every one of you has certain expectations, and most of you are from Portugal, some are from other countries, so you carry some of your own cultural background, and this is the encoding, decoding model of Stuart Hall. So, Coubertin and the Olympic Games. Here you have the sort of shift of Coubertin from the young, energetic Coubertin to the old, reflecting Coubertin. Coubertin's motto was "Mens fervida in corpore lacatoso," a fermenting spirit in muscular body. And he always poked fun at the mens sana image, because Citius Altius Fortius has nothing to do with health. Elite sport has nothing to do with health. Elite sport starts where health ends. And when you read Coubertin's speech at the Olympic Congress in 1914 in Paris, just prior to the Sarajevo shooting, which led to World War I, there is nothing in his speech that talks about the Olympics as a peace movement. But Coubertin is calling for the athletes to be ready for the next war. And he said that he was ready, and so would be everybody else. So no Olympic peace, no Olympic truce, but straightforward connection of war and elite athletes, including the Olympic Games. Sport served for manliness and for the preparation of war. But then the Olympic Games from Greek antiquity onward are part of Western heritage. The Olympic symbols are universal. Coubertin himself wanted to have the Olympic Games just like the World Exposition. World Expositions were there already. World Expositions showed people the engineering skill of that country, and he wanted to show them as well the athletic skill and the physical prowess of the people. So the idea that you compare manpower and how people develop manpower in their own system is there already right at the beginning. The Olympic Committee Coubertin set up was constructed just like the Jockey Club in England that runs the English Derby, that owns most of Ascot and has about 50% people with knowledge and about 50% nobility, people with prestige. And this 50-50 mix was there in the IOC from the very beginning. The Jockey Club is self-recruiting with co-option. The current members have to agree to accept the new members. You can't apply, you're invited to join. But the Jockey Club was sport and big business. The Jockey Club today is worth several billion pounds because of what they're doing. And if you see the development of the Olympic Games and of the IOC, maybe Coubertin knew what he was doing financially as well, at least in this case. Coubertin followed John Ruskin, and John Ruskin tried to make everything beautiful, because beautiful and unique things have the highest value. Beauty has to be universally understood. Quality is never an accident. It's always the result of intelligent effort. In his early writings, Coubertin wrote about ruskiniser les Jeux Olympiques, so to Ruskinize the Olympic Games, to make them beautiful and unique. He was fiddling around with symbols so that the symbols really were understood universally, and obviously he did a good job. Maybe you should remember John Ruskin's father, John James Ruskin. He was a sherry merchant, a sherry importer in London, and he tested various shapes of bottles, various shapes of etiquettes on the bottles to see how they should be made to receive the highest amount of money when he sold them with the exact same content. Ruskin's father was already in branding and developing a package that would sell. And John Ruskin, as professor of aesthetics in Oxford, followed the idea of his father, and Coubertin followed the idea of John Ruskin. One of the problems you have from the very beginning is that the Olympic Games is a competition of individual athletes unless you have relay teams, rowing teams, or other teams. The Olympic Games of antiquity, they were all Greeks, but they represented their city-state. So the question of what is a nation was very virulent at the end of the 19th century, and it was virulent then. So Coubertin came up with his own Olympic geography, which really was, some of it was probably by accident and some of it was smart, because just like Scotland or Catalonia or the Basque country today, there are always nationalities that feel deprived of their own state, deprived of part of their identity. And this national fervor is strongest probably in countries that don't have a country. So from the very beginning, Bohemia, which has a long tradition, but it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, had a separate team with a separate flag. Finland, at that part an archdukedom of Russia, had a separate team and a separate flag. So today the IOC has more member countries than the United Nations, because the Olympic geography still permits a higher degree of nationalism. If you look at the political system, you have four major players. You have the IOC, you have the organizing committee, you have the participants, and you have the mass media. The whole thing, that's why it's Western heritage. At the 1904 Olympics, you had anthropological days showing that whites are better than natives. At the St. Louis World Fair in 1904, They exhibited people that they had brought in from all over the world. And in anthropological days, these natives were doing sport. So they had people doing javelin throwing, and obviously if you give someone a javelin and just make him start javelin throwing, he isn't as good as somebody who was trained for 10 years. So white supremacy was obvious. What you could also see is how racial segregation shows up in certain countries. In the United States, Jesse Owens was very relaxed in Berlin because during the college season, on every second meet, he could not take part. He was at Ohio State, which is just at the Jason-Dixon line, so he was sort of southernmost university of the North. When his team traveled to the South, he had to stay home, because in the South it was in track and field, either black or white. He was at a white university, so he had to stay home because he couldn't compete. The same problem was with the Olympic trials of 1936 and all of the years before. You had regional trials and then you had national trials. A black person from the South, if he wanted to make the Olympic team, had to travel north, because at the selection meet in the South, he was not permitted to participate. In the North he was. So the first colored Olympic champion, John Taylor, was from Philadelphia. The first swimming Olympic champion from Hawaii, a Polynesian, in 1912, was Duke Kahanamoku. Now, we were at nationalism, and here you have Peter O'Connor, an Irish person, who at the time of the 1906 Olympics, Ireland had already in the national movement a national sports federation, a Gaelic sports federation, and three good athletes from Ireland traveled to Athens, realizing that they could not compete as Ireland, because Finland and Bohemia could, but Ireland could not, because the British influence was strong enough in the early IOC to prohibit. So they had to compete as Ireland, although they had brought their Irish flag. So in 1906, the Irish flag was shown at the Olympic Games for the first time, because Peter O'Connor climbed the flagpole and waved the Irish flag at the victory ceremony when there was a British flag up there. So political demonstration of the Olympic Games did not start in '68, they started in 1906. The IOC kept an official medal table until 1928, and the medal table shows world ranking, which is an advantage for countries with good population. However, young countries have also a chance to show themselves. So the Sydney Herald, after the 1912 Olympics, wrote that the Olympic Games providing magnificent advertising for a young nation. And that's still the case until today. Germany applied and got the Olympic Games of 1916. And Martin Werner, a Berlin journalist, wrote, "The Olympic Games are a war, a real war. You can be sure that many participants are willing to offer without hesitation several years of their life for a victory of the fatherland. The Olympic idea of the modern era has given us a symbol of world war, which does not show its military character very open, but for those who can read sports statistics, it gives enough insight into world ranking." What you should see at the time was that the German parliament in January 1914 was the first parliament in the world to provide money for the preparation of athletes. This was disputed in parliament, and the financial committee was against it. However, Theodor Liewald convinced them that the Olympic Games are a world exposition, and just as much as the Reich Imperial Parliament provided money for, not just for the staging of the exposition, but also for the preparation of the German pavilion and the sending of everything, like 1904 to St. Louis exposition. So they should also pay for the preparation of the athletes. And with the money, a German-speaking American national coach for track and field was hired, Erwin Krenzlein, who did his contract halfway through World War I until the United States entered the war, simply because he was paid so well that he would have been a fool to go back to the United States to his meager salary there. In the IOC Congress in 1914, the role of women was discussed. Now, since the Olympic Games are for the preparation of men ready to fight a war, Coubertin and the Americans were against the participation of women in the first place, and then the discussion was, should in the official medal table a woman's medal count the same as a men's medal? And they agreed that it should, but that every sports federation should decide whether they permitted women to participate or not. Here you have some of the Olympic symbols and when they came up with. So you see that the 1936 Olympics, they have the Olympic emblem, they have the Olympic torch relay, but all of the other things were there already before. Even the state amateur was not invented by the Italian fascists or the Nazis. It was invented by the Swedes in the preparation of the 1912 Olympics. Actually, they did something very easy. Swedish men, they called up the Olympic team men for 6 months compulsory military training. So those 6 months prior to the games, they were in full-time training, being paid just as they would have been paid if they really were doing military training. So there you have the first state amateurs. In 1932, you had what was called the Mussolini boys. They were second in Los Angeles, beating everybody else except the United States. And after World War II, you had was Russian training theory, something that is still working well today, even though it's part of the Soviet era. Now, the 36 Olympics, if you read the Nazi papers at the time of the 32 Olympics, you wouldn't imagine that the Nazis were ready to stage the games, because they complained about the Americans permitting animals to run races in a human race, because in their terminology, a colored athlete was nothing but an ape. So the IOC sent Ritter von Hult, who was an IOC member, in an interview with Hitler to ask how he would treat the Olympic rules. Hitler wasn't in power at the time, and Hitler said yes, if the games would be coming to Germany, he would accept all the Olympic rules and accept everything the way it was supposed to be. When he came into power and set up the government in March 1933, 5 days after Goebbels became propaganda minister, Theodor Lewald, the president of the organizing committee, the same one who had convinced in Parliament in 1914 that athletes should be paid, had an interview with Goebbels. And he convinced Goebbels that the Olympic Games are the best propaganda possibility he could imagine. And Goebbels bought it. I mean, if you're in office for 5 days, you probably have different things to do than to worry about Olympic Games in over 3 years. But he still accepted it. there was a lot of international noise that the Olympic Games were breaking the cultural isolation of the German Reich because German Jews were already persecuted, and Hitler did not get involved until the IOC had confirmed that the Olympic Games were given to Berlin and was staying in Berlin. In October 1933, Hitler agreed that if you have the whole world as guests, you're not going to give them some provisionary thing, but something to remember. And he put in 20 times the amount of money than the organizing committee had originally asked for, building a new stadium rather than repairing an old one. And something else happened at the same time, which is, I guess, typical for some sport functionaries. Karl Dien, who was the Secretary General of the organizing committee, when he realized that he now had 20 times the funds than he had before, he increased his own salary with a factor of 5. So he wrote into the budget 5 times as much money as he had in there before. The major dispute about participation or non-participation took place in the United States, where eventually the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, the sports federation, agreed with only a 3-vote majority to go. In the AAU, Eric Brundage was in favor of going. General Sherrill, IOC member, did something else. He went to Hitler. And he had a 1-hour interview with Hitler, of which there are different records. The best one is probably by the translator. And there also is a letter of Sherrill in the IOC archives. Sherrill told Hitler, why don't you do it like we do it in the United States? We have a token Negro on every team. You have to have one. So why don't you take a token Jew? And Hitler said, no, these are German Olympic Games. These are Olympic Games in Germany, and we won't have a token Jew. And Hitler, after Sherrill insisted, really got mad and screamed. And eventually said, if the United States are going to boycott, then we'll have purely German Olympic Games. So they had a plan B if things would go wrong. The purely German Olympic Games that Germany had in 1920 and 1924, when Germany was banned from the International Olympic Games because of their involvement in World War I. So this is the only athlete who definitely suffered from Hitler's ruling, because the Nuremberg racial laws of September 1935 permitted so-called half-Jews, so 50% of your grandparents were Jewish, permitted half-Jews, if they were not married to a Jew, to continue in German life. Gretel Bergmann, who was the best German high jumper at the time, with her time she did at regional championships, she equaled the world record. She had to stay home, applied for emigration, went to the United States, and was the only one who actually suffered from the ruling. In the Winter Games, Rudi Ball, a top ice hockey player who had been kicked out of his Berlin ice hockey club because he was 50% Jewish, he had gone to Italy and played semi-professional hockey for Cortina. They invited him back to play on the German team. Theodor Lewald, half Jewish, could continue as president of the organizing committee. And here you have the alibi picture the world had waited for. Helene Meyer, 50% Jewish, who had been a student in California, came back for the games one silver medal in foil fencing, and gave the Nazi salute at the victory ceremony. So actually what Cheryl had proposed, take a token Jew, make him go to the games, it really worked, and Helene Meyer made it work. Now the other things you can see at the Olympic Games is that you on the one hand have the demonstration of power. Here you have what you might call a mixed zone, because in the middle you have the heads of states and power, and alongside you have the spectators. But here you have the normal fans. And the fans at the 1936 Olympics weren't any different from fans at anywhere, at any time. Here they're waiting to enter the stadium because between the morning heats and the afternoon and evening finals, there was time when they cleaned up the stadium and the fans waiting outside. So fans were there and fans behaved just like fans everywhere. Inside, you see that the Olympic Games also create a culture of consent. At that time, Germans were enthusiastic about Nazism. They were enthusiastic about what they were doing with the Olympic Games. And it didn't take a demonstration of power. The Langemark Memorial Hall, Langemark was one of the early battles in World War I, where a whole battalion of young people died, And inside the Olympic Stadium you have the Langemark Memorial Hall, and Hitler went to the Langemark Hall first before he opened the Olympic Games. From there he went directly to the opening ceremony. And the Reichssportführer von Schammer, when he died in 1943, was also buried there. This is how Germany liked to see itself. It was German Lutz Long and Jesse Owens, and apparently Lutz Long helped Jesse Owens winning the long jump. And this was part of the culture of consent, part of showing to the world how they'd like to be seen, and also to their own population. Now this is a photo that was not shown in Germany at the time. Carlo de Vries from Norfolk in California kissed Hitler. If it was shown at the time in Germany, it would be quite obvious that Hitler was easily to be murdered, because if someone comes so close asking for an autograph and then kissing Hitler, chances are that if you want to kill him, his security isn't up to par. This is a German team marching into the stadium, and you see the one in front with the German flag, Hans Fritsch, the flag bearer. He marched out of step, and he didn't win a medal. So the week after the Olympic Games, his privileged life as a state amateur ended, and he really went into flight training in Braunschweig for the Air Force, while from 1933 until that time he had trained twice a day on the salary of a second lieutenant in the Air Force. And of course you also had Coca-Cola already at the Olympic Games. Coca-Cola was there since at least 1928 in Amsterdam. And one of the other things from Amsterdam that helped the Olympic Games in Berlin, Amsterdam was the first Olympic Games where the photo rights were sold. So in 1936, the propaganda ministry bought the photo rights and prohibited any other photographers inside the Olympic stadium or Olympic installations, and had the complete right on their side. They also made it difficult for people to broadcast from the Olympic Games because of something at the 1932 Olympics. The United States had sold the radio rights. So they used the rules that were already there to make something exclusive for them. Of course, the Olympic Games also served as sort of a pretext. When Germany, after the Games, invaded the Rhineland, it was in his speech, Hitler said, well, you can see how friendly we treated the French at the Winter Games. You shouldn't expect them, you shouldn't expect us to do anything bad to them. One of the things about the 36 Games you really don't know is what is propaganda ministry and what is actually sport. And one of the examples is the torch relay, because an official from the propaganda ministry was the chairman of the committee that invented the torch relay. Now on the committee Karl Dien was, and after the war Haggard was dead and Karl Dien was alive and said he invented the relay. Now no one really knows because the minutes of the committee do no longer exist. But certainly Dien knew something about road relays, and certainly Haggard knew something about staging a show and propaganda. After the 36 Olympics, Leni Riefenstahl, with its film that received the highest acclaim, showed the Games. Actually, only the Catholic Church put it on the index, but not because it celebrated Nazism, but because it showed some athletes, some nude athletes. The Cold War is just the consequence of it. And then you have, since 1936, the Olympic Games as a media event and people jumping on the possibility of the media event. Using the big stage and bringing conflicts that are in their own country onto world attention. And some of the boycotts afterwards can be seen in a similar vein, because you don't boycott if it's not worthwhile boycotting. The IOC gave the Olympic Winter Games of 1940 again to Germany. And this was after the Munich Treaty had been broken by Germany and Czechoslovakia had completely been invaded. Because the IOC preferred to have Olympic Games in an expanding Nazi country than not having Olympic Games. And in 1939, prior to at the beginning of World War I, the IOC Executive Committee had a postal vote how to deal with the war. And they asked, can the Olympic Games be taken away from a neutral country as it is dangerous to get there? And the Executive Committee said no. Can the Olympic Games take place during the war? Yes. Should the whole IOC be asked? Yes. But the whole IOC was never asked because Germany was giving back the Games because the Winter Games because of the war, and Finland also gave back the Games. So, Ruskianism works. The Olympic Games are political neutral, and I think what might one worry is an interview Coubertin gave to André Lang of Le Journal after the 36 Olympic Games. And Coubertin said these were marvelous games. Hitler assured a perfect celebration. He did not take them over. What is the difference whether you advertise perfect weather with the Games in Southern California or a political regime in Berlin? The important thing is that the Olympic Games are celebrated in a dignified manner. Coubertin is, of course, paraphrasing the Epistle of St. Paul's to the Philippians, and Coubertin received money from the Nazi government, and I don't know whether he was bribed or whether he was getting senile, or whether this was really his opinion, because you can't really ask them. He was broke, and he received 50,000 gold marks from the German Reich, which is about 300,000 US dollars off on the consumer price index of today. The open questions are, has there ever been the belief that the competition should represent the noble sports practice? If yes, when has it disappeared? Are athletes really good soldiers in modern warfare? Is the IOC gender relation really an example worth following? If the IOC today is a multi-billion dollar company, should its history better be treated like economic history, or sport history, or cultural history? Is there a neoliberal Olympism? In 1986, at 50 years Olympic Games of 36, Jean-Marie Brom and Harry Burnett discussed at a German conference, and Burnett said the Nazis have misused and perverted the Olympic Games, and Jean-Marie Brom said the Olympic Games is a fascist exercise, and only a fascist country can celebrate it in such a splendid manner as Germany in 1936. Kranzü in 2000 wrote a longer essay, "It is a history to admire sports heroes. Our enthusiasm springs from the very core of fascist ideology, admiration for strength and contempt of weakness. Have Olympic values changed in light of commercialism? What is better, to buy, sell a political system, or to buy, sell a product?" This is the current question. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kruger. Before we move into our coffee break, I think we now have time for questions. So if you have a question, in order to break the ice, I will put myself a question to Professor Kruger, and I'm going to pick up one of the last topics that you came up with. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more of the role of athletes as soldiers during the two world wars, because you mentioned the First World War with some of Pierre de Coubertin's emphasis, saying that the soldiers, athletes should be prepared to go to war, and then you mentioned the Olympics of 1940 and the Winter Olympics. So that was the question.
Well, let me give you two examples. I come from a family of athletes. My father was in a workers' sports club, and eventually he gave up sport for a career in his actual work. His younger brother did not. He joined the SS as a professional athlete, because after the 1936 Olympics, the SS, the SR, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, they all wanted to show at the 1940 Olympic Games that they have the majority of the team, that they have the best men. I talked to my uncle, and he said, well, he joined the SS because there he had the assurance to train twice a day, 7 days a week, train 30 hours a week, get decent food, prepare for the Olympics. He was a good swimmer, he was a good runner, he came from the countryside, he could ride, he could shoot, and fencing he had to learn. And they recruited him. And he was very proud to be recruited. Was he a good soldier? No. On the invasion of Denmark, the neighbor of him stepped on another athlete, stepped on a landmine. For the rest of the war and afterwards, my uncle had so many operations to take so many grenade splinters out of him. And even until the rest of his life, he felt most happy when he could crouch and sit on a lake and fish, because then the remaining metal in him didn't hurt. So an athlete, if he's an athlete, doesn't automatically become a good soldier. Now if you take Hans Fritsch, the flag bearer, he went into flight training. He became a fighter pilot in World War II. He was a very highly decorated fighter pilot who downed more than 120 foreign planes. Eventually he became a fighter pilot instructor. Eventually there were no more planes to instruct people, so there was an army of the remains of all sorts of armies on which he was on the chief of staff. They were supposed to defend Oldenburg until the last man. Well, they did not. They marched out on the field, and he was the interpreter of the capitulation talks, and was realized by the British as the athlete. So he went there as the interpreter of the Germans, and he left as the interpreter of the British. And eventually was quite influential in the training of pilots of the German post-World War II Air Force. So do you become a good soldier? It really depends on yourself, it really depends on the circumstances. Chances are that you're fitter than anybody else. But being fit in modern warfare, where pressing a button really makes a difference. Does it help to be fit?
Thank you very much.
One question.
Starting to the last open question, say, is there a neoliberalism, a neoliberal Olympism? My question is, how the Olympism during the years has demonstrated like a capacity to adapt to the situation, the external situation?
I think the 1981 Baden-Baden Olympic Congress is sort of a turning point, because until that time, under the influence of Everett Brundage and a lot of other people, you defended amateurism. On the other hand, it was obvious that if the West is doping, if the East is doping, if you're using all of the possibilities, then the last possibility that you can still use is the impetus of straightforward neoliberal capitalism. Make the athletes get paid, and if they get paid better, maybe they run faster. I was German youth champion in 1962. I was German masters champion in 1976. And in between my best year, I was 9th in the world. So from that you could live, but you couldn't really amass a fortune. In some countries you were better off, in some countries you were not as good off, but you could live off it. Now, if I'd lived 10 years later, I would have gotten for the very same result about 20 times as much money. I helped organize track meets, the Berlin track meet, and could see how much money athletes were making after my time and how this progressed and progressed. So of course some of the dangers are there if you're are there in terms of running health risks or being dependent on your surroundings. Mashiko Kimura, a Japanese scholar who died not long ago, she wrote a very clever paper saying that it really is all a question of who has the power. Now, in terms of the amateur times, the power was very easily with the federations, because everyone knew that everyone was not an amateur. So you could be banned just on, just had to get the papers and show that you were banned. And that the whole doping discussion at first was the very same. The federations knew who was taking what and could take everyone out of the picture if they wanted. Now, with the separation of WADA, this has changed somewhat, but basically it hasn't really changed that much. That's why the percentage of people being caught is so small.
Yes, one question.
Well, unfortunately, what the Brazilian government wanted to do with the Olympic doesn't really work because of the political turmoil in Brazil, because of the world economic difficulties, because they wanted to show themselves, just as Mexico had showed in '68, that they are no longer at the verge of being a world power, but that they have already that they're already there. Now it looks as if they can't really show what they had planned to show, because not enough money, because the problems are bigger than they expected them to be, because of things going slower in South America than the IOC expect things to go in Europe or in North America. So what we will see at the Olympic Games is hopefully very happy games, because things don't have to be perfect to be happy. Carnival in Rio is not perfect, it's happy. And if the Olympic Games are happy games, I think it is far better than if they are perfectly organized games, because if you're in South America, very few things are perfectly organized, and if they are perfectly organized, you tend to have a military dictatorship. And so if they're happy games, I think we all can be very glad. And I hope that they're far enough away from international terrorism, because as I've pointed out, the Olympic Games, as being a major stage, of course invites people who want to use the stage who do not have any business being there, and spoil what too many other peoples have tried to organize for the benefit for their own benefit, for the benefit of the athletes, maybe even for the benefit of the sponsors, but they're organizing to do something very pleasant, and sometimes this is just a very big stage for something very unpleasant.
Thank you very much.